I wanted to kind of set the stage of what it was like and why the Chinese first came and who were they. Well, the first Chinese that came, there were three of them actually in 1848 on February 9th. And these three, there were two men who went to the goat fields. And then there was a woman. And up until about 5 years ago, we didn't know too much about the woman. The woman was Maria C. And she went to the home of Reverend Charles Gillespie, who had actually brought over the three of them. And she never got married, and she lived with the Gillespies, and she became a super, super, super Christian. And she was able to convert a lot of Chinese to Christianity in 1848. And those were the first three. And then in 1849, we had around 700 men, and still there was just the one woman, Maria. And then in 1850 to 1860, there were 41,000 men, and now there were 7 women. In 1869 to 1870, there were 64,301 men and 11 women. And then in 1871 to 1880, there was 123,201 males and 23 women. So you can tell that the women were very exclusive and very popular here. But the reason why they were here, why we had such a despairing population, was because the men came here to work. I mean, they definitely were here for a sojourner. They came with the idea that they were going to work and then go back to China. In fact, some of the old literature says, they had a letter from a wife to her husband in China that said, you told me you were going over for 3 years to work, and it's been 30. When are you coming home? Well, why did these early Chinese come over? And, it was very difficult for them once they got here. And they came over because in China at this time, they had the Manchu-Ru. And the Manchu-Ru, they were the Manchurians that came into China, and they were not nice to the Chinese. In fact, they were the ones who had the Chinese wear the queue. The queue is not indigenous to the Chinese. It was because the Manchus said, we want to be able to identify who you are, and so it was a symbol of subjugation, the queue. And then through the years, when they came over here, you always see the old Chinese pictures, and they were wearing the queue. And there's all kinds of legends that if the queue was cut off, they're not going to get to heaven. But the Chinese don't believe in heaven anyway. But they wouldn't get to wherever they're going in their afterlife. The other thing was the Taiping Rebellion, and the Taiping Rebellion started in the South, and it was from 1850 to 1864. And during the Taiping Rebellion, 20 million Chinese people died. So it wasn't a very great scene for them to come over. Then, of course, there were Western wars, and Westerners were going into China, and they were cutting up China. And there was drought, and there was famine. But overriding all of that was hi, Terry. There was this great need for labor in the U.S. And certainly that was the time of the railroad, and I know you saw the railroad exhibit, and your next speaker is going to talk about the need of labor for the railroad. And certainly the railroad, the joining of the spike was 150 years ago on May 10th in 1869. Well, because of this big onslaught of Chinese people coming to America, it worried Congress. It worried everybody. It just didn't worry Congress. And so Congress did pass in 1882 a very important act, which was the exclusion law that said no more Chinese can come in. That's it. We're not going to have any more Chinese come in. And it was the first act in American history, and probably one of the very few, that placed broad restrictions on immigration, and the only one to single out one specific target, and that was the Chinese. And they said in 1882, okay, no more Chinese can come in. And then it was extended again in 1892, and then in 1902 with the Geary Act and the Scott Act. And then what happened was we had the earthquake in 1906. Now everybody remembers the earthquake. And the earthquake destroyed San Francisco, but more than that, it destroyed City Hall. And it was just, because they destroyed City Hall, there were no more records on the early Chinese. And there were early Chinese that went back to China during that period, had kids, and then they would come back here. Well, because they could come back here, we had no records on them, on these kids. And actually, the records show, and I thought this was really interesting, the records show that these men that went back to China, they would have, on an average, 14 sons. And they never had any daughters. They only had sons. And then when the sons came over, they would say, well, who are you? And they said, oh, I'm the son of so-and-so. And he was here in America as an American citizen, went back to China, had these kids, and brought all these sons back. And that was the birth of what we call the paper sons. That they would adopt these names, these last names, and say they were the son of so-and-so. But can you imagine having 14 sons that were yours during this 1 year that you were there? I mean, it's kind of an amazing time. But it was a watershed event for immigration, and it was a watershed for the Chinese to be able to come over here. And so in 1890, Yen Chu was over here already, and that was Thomas Foon Chew's father. And he went back to China, and he married, and he only had one son, and that was Thomas Foon Chew. And Thomas Foon Chew came over at the time of the earthquake. He came over right in 1907 after the earthquake, and under the time that he was allowed to come in. Yen Chu before that had a little cannery, and it was called Prejudice Cannery, and it was in San Francisco, and it was on Broadway and Sampson Street. And so after the earthquake, the cannery was destroyed, and so he went down to El Viso, and he brought his son down to El Viso, and brought his wife came down at a later time. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to also mention that the early Chinese that came, like Yen Chu, were all from the Canton area. And they were all, and the reason why they were from the Canton area, and here's your map of the Canton area where they came from. The Canton area where they came from is in the south, and it's in the southeast, and it's very small. I mean, if I had to do a comparison, it's like a little city in Florida. It's a very small part of China. And the reason why that they all came from this one area was because the Chinese, the capital of China was Beijing, which is up north. And Beijing had very little control over way down south. And this southern area is where the Taiping Rebellion actually, the leader of the Taiping Rebellion came from. So this one area was suffering from famine and from drought, and it was the only area that Westerners actually had some familiarity with because China was not opened to foreigners at the time. So they weren't that worried or that scared about foreigners. And so that's why they all came from this one little area of China. And you can see the blue is Guangzhou, and that's where Yen Chu's family came, and that's where Thomas Foon Chew's family came. Yen Chu only actually canned tomatoes. He didn't can fruit and vegetables. And when he moved down to El Viso and brought Thomas Foon with him, it was actually his son, Thomas Foon Chew, that really brought the cannery to fruition. Well, it was not without a lot of challenges. First of all, Thomas Foon Chew could not speak English, and he had to go to San Francisco to learn English because they didn't have, for the longest time, Chinese students could not go to American schools. And so San Francisco, because it was such a hub, was one of the few areas that the Chinese could actually go to school and learn English. And Thomas Foon, Thomas Foon was educated. In fact, they said that his English was so good. I interviewed his foreman, and his foreman said his English was so good that if you put a sheet between him and another person, you would have thought that he was an American, that he could speak so well. So when he was 20, he married my grandmother, who was she was from a wealthy Oakland family, and her name was Li Gum Ching. Actually, I did know my grandmother. I didn't know my grandfather because he died before I was born, but my grandmother lived till she was 99. And she was born in Oakland, never spoke a word of English, and the most amazing thing, she had bound feet. Yeah, and here in the United States, and I don't know how many of you know about women binding their feet in China, but it was the reason why they did it was because it was really sexy to look at a woman trying to walk with bound feet from the rear. That she kind of waddled, and they thought that was really only those of a higher class had these bound feet because she could never walk. Once the feet were bound, it was very difficult for her to move around, and she would always need help walking. And my grandmother came from a family of 17, and she was number 3. And it was marvelous because growing up, she would have a birthday party. She and her sister, number 4, would be in competition who would give the bigger birthday party. And she would have all the relatives. And every year, the party got bigger and bigger because the families got bigger and bigger, and that was the only time that we would know our cousins. And so when both of them died years later, we just kind of lost contact with all these cousins. So my grandmother and he got married, and they raised all their kids in Alviso. My grandmother had 9 children. Whoops, let's see. Okay. Well, first of all, where is Alviso? Alviso is in the bottom of the bay. It's between San Jose and Fremont. How many of you know where Alviso is? Oh, good. Then I don't have to explain where Alviso is. And it was sunny. The weather was great. It's a great area. Alviso is just a great area to have a farm, and you can expand your farm. And so they were known for tomatoes. In fact, if you go out to Alviso today, there are remnants of the cannery. In fact, I don't have the pictures of the cannery, but the next time I give this talk, I'll have pictures of the cannery. Well, in its heyday, this Bayside Cannery in Alviso hired 5,000 to 6,000 workers. It was the 3rd largest cannery behind Libby and Del Monte. And the buildings are still there, but they're not going to be there for very long because they're all decaying and they don't look so great. And one of the things about Thomas Foon Chew, not only could he speak English really well, but people really trusted him. He had this intuitive intelligence. He had a business sense. He had integrity and honesty. And he would go between the Caucasians as well as the Chinese. Most of the people who worked for him were Chinese. And I remember going to Val's, and the owner of Val's in Alviso, the restaurant, she knew my grandfather. And I said, well, what was he like? And she said, we trusted him, and when he died, before he died, he said, you will never have to pay for water. You'll never get a water bill as long as I live. And then he died, and she got a water bill. And she was shocked that she had to pay for water. And it was because he had such integrity. He put up a great big water tower in Alviso, but also he said he would always pay for everybody in Alviso's water bill, and they would never have to pay for water. And they really liked him, and she really spoke very well of him. He always surrounded himself with competent people, and he always said that the people that work for me are more competent and more qualified than he was. And I'm going to show you in a minute Okay, this is a picture of my grandfather in his younger days. And he was taller than most Chinese. That he was 5'8", and in those days 5'8" is pretty tall. And the workers really liked him. He said, and he was very kind to the workers. Like I said, I interviewed Bob He, who was his foreman. And his wife, Ruby, was really a kick and a half. She said, we came from San Francisco, got married. I was a young bride when I came to Alviso, and I hated every minute. I said, really? She says, he had a dormitory for single men, and it would hold 100 men in that dormitory. But if you were married, he had these little huts for married folk, and he said Alviso was so windy that no matter what she did, she would just, she would dust all day long, and still, it's like living in a windstorm. That was one thing. But the big thing was the men would gamble, but there's nothing for the women to do. So there's no social life. So the only social life she would have is going up to San Francisco and seeing her old friends. And she used to say that San Francisco was so far away during those days that she didn't get up there hardly enough. Well, I have all these things about his buildings that are there. But like I said, if you have a chance to go out to El Viso, the cannery is still there. Well, he opened two other canneries and also a fishing village. So he opened one in Mayfield, and the Mayfield canned apricots and pears. Apricots, pears, and apples are the three things. And the Mayfield cannery is where Fry's Electronics is, in Palo Alto. If you go down and you notice that Fry's is built on a levee, and the reason why it's built on a levee is so the trucks from Bayside Cannery can load the trucks from that levee at Mayfield. And then he had one in the Delta, and in the Delta it was in Alto. How many of you know where Alto is? Okay, well, it's right on the Delta near Walnut Grove, and he grew asparagus. And from that cannery, he was known as the Asparagus King because it was so profitable. And one of the things that he did in growing his asparagus is he shipped it green, because up until that time, asparagus was only shipped when it was white. And the reason why is because asparagus is so fragile. So if you look at the Bayside Cannery cans, they're square. That he invented the square can so he could put the asparagus in squarely. And he would have it cooked before it went out. He would have it cooked in these big wicker baskets, and it would be dropped into a vat of boiling water, and then it would be put into these square cans. And like I said, he was known as the Asparagus King. Another area was in Dos Palos near Yuba City, and he grew rice. And they said, oh, you're never going to grow rice here. The land is really too hard. And so he took 25 of his workers and dynamite, and he just dynamite the land and broke it all up. And then he had a big rice farm. Recently, there's a fellow with the San Jose Museum, and he told me that my grandfather had a piece of property in Sunnyvale that he used to grow fruits in Sunnyvale, and he has the deed. But this, I have not seen the deed or known any of his holdings in Sunnyvale. So he was known for tomatoes, for asparagus, and then I have to tell you, my mom, my mom was born here, and my grandfather had really bad asthma, so he bought a home in Los Gatos. And so my mom was the first Chinese woman to graduate from Los Gatos High in the same class as Olivia de Havilland. But of course, Olivia de Havilland is still going strong. But she tells me all these stories, and she never ate fruit. She only ate Asian fruit, like she would eat papaya and mango, but she would never eat apricots, apples, and pears. And I would say, how come you never ate, regular fruit? And she said, I had so much fruit when I was a kid, I don't ever want to have any more fruit. And this is a picture of the family. My grandmother is the one on the left, and my mom is the one. She's the next one. My mom was the oldest daughter, and my uncle is the one on the right. My grandfather's next to him, and my uncle today, that's my uncle here. Oh, this one, and if I could, I would show you this invitation. I got an invitation to his 95th birthday party, and it was so cute because they used his old pictures of Elviso and when he was young. Here's a picture of the cannery and my grandfather at the cannery with his boss, and he would hire. This is DeBack. William DeBack is another worker. He was the caretaker, and I was so fortunate to be able to talk to him about my grandfather before he passed away. And here's another shot of my grandmother. And my grandfather isn't there, but those are all the kids. The two of them died very young, so there were 7. And my uncle, the youngest one, is the only one that's alive, and he's just turning 95 this year. Oh, and that's their home. By the way, that was their home. That was their home in Elviso. And this is another picture, of the family. And my uncle, my oldest uncle, is Uncle Charlie. Just wanted to tell you a story. Uncle Charlie went to Santa Clara, but he didn't want to take over the business at all. And he was a real gambler. He just loved to gamble. In fact, when my mom tells me the story, when she was 3 years old, he put her in a red wagon, took her to the grocery store, and wanted to trade her in for candy. And so growing up, he had 2 gambling casinos in Elviso, on the property for the workers. And, my grandfather thought that was really terrible, so he would take 10 cents out of every paycheck, and he would say he was keeping it in case the workers would lose all their money. They still had money to send back to China or to take back with them. But Uncle Charlie was just this, he was always a gambler. He was taller than my grandfather. He was 5'10". He was very attractive, and I remember meeting this woman. Her husband went to school with my dad, who went to Stanford, and she pulled me aside. She's, elderly woman, and she said, "Gloria, I just want to tell you, I went on a date with your Uncle Charlie." And I said, "Really?" And she says, "I'm from Fresno." I said, "How did he get to take you out in Fresno?" I mean, he was living in San Francisco, but Uncle Charlie had a car. And I said, "It must have taken him all day and all night to get to Fresno to take you out." And she said, "Yes, it did. But he was worth it." So, that's just a little tidbit about my Uncle Charlie. But, I remember as a kid, I grew up in Asia, but I would always come back. We came back to San Francisco maybe once every 2 years. And he used to scare the life out of me. I mean, he was just so awesome. And we would always eat together. All the family would eat together. And all the aunts would be talking and talking, and when he walked into the room, you could hear a pin drop. I mean, no one said anything. And he would look at myself and my sister, and I was like 5 years old or something, and he said, "Okay, what did you learn today?" and I would have nothing to say. And he said, that is not good. You have to learn something every day. And all I could think of was how to deal cards or how to play blackjack or, whatever it was. Okay, so that is my mom, my Uncle Charlie, and my youngest uncle, and her sister. Auntie Tidy was the one on the right, and my mom was the one on the left. And we come to, when he died, when when Grandpa died, it was one of the biggest funerals. He had a funeral. He died on February 25th, 1931, in O'Connor Hospital, and he died from his complications with his asthma. And he had, there were 25,000 spectators, 200 Masons, 5 ranking Rose Koi, and the pallbearers were the mayor of San Francisco and the mayor of San Jose. And he also had the presidents of the Chamber of Commerce. But he was able to cross the line of being, Chinese and still in the Caucasian community. He had 2 funerals. One was in San Francisco and the other was in San Jose. And although he died in February, his funeral wasn't until May of that year because they had to get it all together. And so today there is a street named after him, and it was dedicated to him in 2003, and it's a street that cuts into Zanker Road and Thomas Foon Chew Way. And I just thought I'd bring a picture of my grandmother, who lived till she was 99, and this is a younger picture, and then when the one on the right were all her daughters and daughter-in-laws. Do you have any questions? Yes?
In that picture, I was looking at her feet. It was, so her feet was bound.
Yeah.
Like, she was wearing those special shoes.
Right. And my mom even, her feet weren't bound, but her feet were really small. I mean, she had like a size 4, size 5, and my grandmother had a real hard time buying shoes because it was about a size 1 or 2. But she didn't walk, so I guess it was okay. And whenever she went out to dinner, and she loved to go out to dinner, she would be carried by, one of her sons, or, her daughters. 2 of the daughters would take her everywhere. And she was just fantastic lady. Yes. Yeah.
Gloria, I hope you will share your story about the ketchup.
Oh, that, I was talking to a number of people, and they said El Viso would flood all the time. I mean, the floods would come in, and my grandfather had such charisma. He would tell them, keep on canning, just, fai treaty, to can. And he would say in Chinese to these workers that, hurry up and can, otherwise it'll turn into ketchup. And ketchup is tomato sauce. And that's where we get the term ketchup, is from ketchup.
What does ketchup mean?
It means tomato sauce.
Ketchup in Cantonese is a tomato sauce.
It's ke is fan ke is tomato, and jup is sauce. So
There's no specific spelling for ketchup. No, so that's why. That's the origin. I thought when Gloria told me the story, I thought
So
it was really
funny.
interesting.
Very.
and the foreman would say, "Oh, the waters are coming, and they would come up all the way to their knees, and they would still be canning. They'll be just canning like crazy. Yes.
When did the Mayfield Cannery shut down?
You know, he died in 31, and the cannery in Mayfield, I think it closed in about 34, but he had extended himself way too far. And number one, you know, we had the Depression that came, and he was going to extend the cannery $70,000. In those days, $70,000 was really a big number. So he took out a loan for $70,000 to extend the cannery out and make the cannery a really big cannery. And so when he died, it went into conservatorship. Yes.
My understanding is that the Mayfield cannery was sold to Sutter Canning Company sometime in the late 20s. Do you know about Sutter Canning?
No, I thought it was sold to a fish cannery. But thank you for sharing that.
There's a Sutter Canning Company that was there, and they ran into hot water when they were starting to pollute San Francisco. Actually, it's Matadero Creek there in the city of Palo Alto. When Mayfield was taken over by the city of Palo Alto, Sutter Canning Company was contaminating Matadero Creek. And this is when it was annexed to Palo Alto sometime in the mid-20s. And so somewhere along the line, Thomas Foon sold, or it was taken over by another firm.
Right. Well, you know, actually, that happened in El Viso also. And it was taken over by another firm, and then it became the Pickle Company for a while because it had the cold storage shed down there. And then it became a boat motel. But the remnants of the cannery are still there. I mean, barely. And the next time I give this, I'll have slides. It's not a pretty scene. In fact, it was really sad to see such a big such a big organization go into ruins. Yes, Karen.
What do you know about the growers that he procured the produce from for Alto and Mayfield, and the kind of relationship he had with those? Do you know much about that?
No, I don't. I thought he used his own people in terms of growing. I mean, I don't think he.
Like they had land, a lot of land.
Yes, he did. He did. Yes.
I might be mistaken on this, but when I was running the Los Altos Museum, we learned that most of the growers there, people who had small plots and small orchards, would pick their apricots and then take them by wagon down here to Palo Alto to have them canned. And Mayfield Cannery was one of the most common destinations. So in that case, for local apricots, it would be a lot of small farmers coming and selling their apricots to Mayfield Cannery. It was quite a big deal. You're on the wall of the Los Altos Museum because of that.
Yes, actually, the Los Altos Museum is going to do an exhibit of Thomas Foon Chew, and it's opening, I think, May 2nd, and the exhibit isn't. It's on innovation and entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley. So, and Thomas Foon Chew will have a wall there, and we're working on it now. So it's going to be really fun. Yes.
One more, sorry.
Sure.
What do you know about, how did he get his seed money to start the operation? How did he?
You know, people just really believed that he would pay it back. I mean, people had such trust. He had such integrity that he got loans. And he got loans from Bank of Italy. I mean, like other areas that he would get loans from. And in those days, it wasn't that easy. And I know when when I was talking to my grandmother, and she never spoke a word of English all her life. And she said to me, but your grandfather, the way she put it, he didn't know if he was Chinese or American, because for him, it didn't matter. It wasn't a real major, it wasn't major. Yes, Jerry?
Question. Your grandfather was such a unique person, I believe. He was one of the first great entrepreneurs of what I consider Silicon Valley today. Knowing that, is there anything you think that made him a unique entrepreneur? I mean, in terms of, you said his honesty was very important, his integrity. Those are things that I also noticed about David Packard and other entrepreneurs. Do you think those are the types of things that made him a great entrepreneur?
Oh, I'm sure that was. I'm sure that was. And the very fact that he felt, everyone said he felt comfortable in both, in both the American society. They said he joined the Masons. He joined, and he was really active in the community. So it was, he was very, yeah, he wasn't a shy guy, and the people that I interviewed really liked him. And I'm very proud of being his granddaughter. Yes.
What I think makes him so unique is he was doing this during a period of great Chinese prejudice in this area. It would be like in the Jim Crow South, an African American rising to prominence in 1910 Georgia. It's almost unprecedented. So he must have been a remarkable person to overcome the prejudice of the era.
Well, it was really funny. I talked to my Uncle Charlie about that. And I said, was there a lot of prejudice during that time? He said, grandfather would just said, get over it. And I have to tell you another story about my Uncle Charlie. He was such a ladies' man. And so my grandmother was really concerned about him getting married and said, we really have to find a bride for him. And she went to China 9 times looking for a bride. And she would bring over a woman that she felt was presentable. And I said to her, Grandma, how can you do that? First of all, she doesn't walk. And second of all, you had the exclusion laws, and there was no, Chinese didn't go back and forth. This was, in the 1920s. And I said, were you detained at Angel Island? And she said, no, that's for poor people. We had other people that would go to Angel Island for me, but I don't go to Angel Island. And I have these wonderful, wonderful pictures of her on the steamer boat, just living it up. And she would go and get a wife for Uncle Charlie, bring her back, and then Uncle Charlie would say, no, I don't like her. And then she would have to return her. And it was just, the stories are just amazing. And my mom used to tell me these stories about how when she was growing up in El Viso, she drove when she was 12. In those days, you didn't need a license or anything. And so when she was 14, she had a Packard that she was driving, this great big Packard. And one day, the brake slipped, or her foot slipped, because she was just a really small lady, and the Packard went into the slough. And so they had to lift it up by crane. And she said, I wasn't allowed to drive for 2 months. And I thought, oh. And my grandmother, I remember, her telling me she had, they lived in this big house in El Viso with a big front porch. And every day she would hold court in this front porch. And they would have the wives of all the workers come and talk to each other, and she would have them, she would feed them, and and she would take in their relatives from China and the kids and bring them up. And, it was just, she said it was just a wonderful life in El Viso. She loved it. I said, what about the dust and she says, people complain about everything. But, it was wonderful. She said, these people that complain about the dust and everything. And I told her who complained about the dust. She says, that's because she was born and raised in San Francisco. But if you came from China, you have no complaints. You know, I mean. So with that, I wanted to thank you. I don't want to go over my time because you have another speaker right now. And, you know, if you have any other questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much.